Good evening, everyone. It's a small crowd tonight, but I'm glad it's being recorded so that people will be able to catch up on what promises to be a really fantastic talk. One of a few that we've got coming up this month and next as we sort of see off the semester in style. I have to begin tonight with the sad news of Bill Strickland's death yesterday. Professor Strickland was a legend, an illustrious scholar and activist, faculty member here at UMass who leaves an enormous legacy, a truly national one, both in the realm of scholarship and in the realm of political activism. Irreplaceable as a loss, and we mourn his passing. There will be details forthcoming about services in his honor, and I encourage you to look out for those. But on a happier note, it is my pleasure tonight, as Assistant Director in Whitney's absence, to introduce David Hobbs, who was a fellow here not last summer, but actually the summer before in 2022, and was here with his cohort of fellow Du Bois scholars, the first to come to the center since we were able to open up again after the vagaries of the COVID-19 pandemic. David is Assistant Professor of English at the University of Lethbridge, which is in Canada, but don't hold that against it or him, where he works on 20th and 21st century poetry and poetics, with particular attention to intermedial aesthetics, transnationalism, Black study, and social movements. He has articles in Modernism, Modernity, English Studies, and elsewhere, and he writes frequently for The Nation and The Times Literary Supplement. He's currently finishing his first book, What Can You Do Alone? Lyric, Sociality, and the Global Depression. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Hobbs.
Thanks so much, Abram. That was really nice. And I'm so thrilled to be back. I had a really amazing summer here. And really, as will become clear, I think, in the course of this work, the research that I was able to do at the center and with the support of Adam and Whitney not only changed the trajectory of the book that I've been working on, but also provoked me to think more differently about where and how the tools of literary analysis apply to the contemporary, to the world that we're receiving right now. So, thanks. The work that I'm going to discuss today comes to me entirely, as an accident of the archive. I had arrived at the Du Bois Center in the summer of 2022 with a broad question that I was not yet sure how to answer, but which had its basis in my dissertation research on the Jamaican poet Claude McKay, who is best known now for publishing the first poetry collection of the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem Shadows, and as well as the first best-selling American novel by a Black author, Home to Harlem. By the time McKay had published this debut novel, he was already living abroad. After a visit in the late 1920s, he settled in Morocco in 1930 and spent nearly 5 years there, writing a series of sonnets in a unique disjunctive form, some of which meditate on North Africa's then recent history and economic exploitation. In one of my favorites, he is annoyed by the influx of European tourists whose elevated purchasing power had only inflated during the global downturn. I had wanted to know more about the global Black experience of the Great Depression, its impact on markets and employment, yes, but also on diasporic sensibilities, communities, and politics. How it inflected contact between Black English-speaking thinkers and movements in North America and Europe and those in Liberia, Trinidad, Sudan, the Bahamas, and elsewhere. From US Census data, we know that the impact of the crash of 1929 was disproportionately felt by Black Americans, whose unemployment rate was slightly below the national average in 1928, but ballooned to over 50% in 1931. And we also know that many national economies entangled with the United States', like Jamaica's or Canada's, saw more profound and sustained recessions. We also know that the theorization of the 15th century commercial revolution, in which European trade reoriented itself from cross-Mediterranean trade to Atlantic coastal trade, was one of the vanguard positions in historical economic thinking in the 1930s. Now, we will all take for granted that this commercial revolution uncovers the lucrative horrors of the triangle trade without naming them, but I was wondering if this theory had emerged in tandem with a rising contemporaneous awareness of African trade, treaties, or an increasing visibility of colonial exploitation, occurring at the precise historical moment that, following Marcus Garvey's decline and deportation, thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois were beginning to see more and more wisdom in the idea of an expatriation to Africa. Simply put, I wanted to know what Black economists and sociologists were thinking. It helped that I was beginning to work on poet, critic, and folklorist Sterling A. Brown, who had been editor of Negro Affairs for the Federal Writers Project from 1936 to 1940, where among many other projects, he oversaw Claude McKay's sociological study, Harlem Negro Metropolis, which is particularly attuned to Harlem's place within an increasingly mobile diaspora. Brown seemed to be in a unique position to receive and disseminate information about the diaspora's experience of the Depression. It helped, too, that he was close friends with Abram L. Harris, the second Black American to receive a PhD in economics from Columbia University in 1930, and the first Black American economist to pursue a career in academia. While Harris appears only once in Lawrence P. Jackson's intellectual history, The Indignant Generation, a path-breaking account of Black writers and critics who came into prominence during the Great Depression and helped institutionalize the writing of the New Negro movement, he is included next to Brown in a type of photograph that makes you Google someone. As you can see, it depicts the two men, piped jauntily askance, on the Howard campus, where they were part of an early career group of professors who called themselves the Young Turks, while some others knew them as the Thinkers and Drinkers set. Harris was extremely ambitious, even within a group of ambitious young intellectuals. He first submitted to the Crisis in 1919 when he was only 20 years old, seeking to tell the story of an episode in his hometown of Richmond, Virginia, that occurred shortly after the end of the First World War, when a public, quote, plea for social equality by Niagara Movement founder William Monroe Trotter was disrupted by an armed force headed by the local police chief. Du Bois had declined to publish the account due to lack of space, but left a handwritten note on the covering letter. See if he's a subscriber. Harris was also openly schematically Marxist in his two book-length studies of Black economic life written during the 1930s. Not just in terms of quantitative analysis, but also highly attuned to the alienation of labor and to the psychological disciplining that occurs within local and international structures of exploitation. Reviewing Scott Nearing's Black America for the Nation under the title Black Proletarians, he characterizes Nearing's story as one that could be found in, quote, the files of any well-managed urban league office, while celebrating Nearing's conclusion that, quote, to be Black in the United States today is to be proletarian. But without Nearing's wading into the psychology of white and Black workers, why, Harris asked, does the former seem, quote, to prefer the material rewards of welfare capitalism to the ideals of class-conscious unionism? And why, Harris asked, do the great mass of the latter appear to him sometimes to have not formed, quote, proletarian psychology? And without an adequate explanation of how these have occurred, Harris found that Nearing left much undone in the way of the economic interpretation of the most important phenomenon. In a 1930 article for The Crisis, Harris would be still blunter while expanding his scope. Quote, the two great obstacles to labor solidarity are the psychology of craft unionism and the psychology of race prejudice, he would write, while provoking the American Federation of Labor to live up to its promise to Black locals to be the conduit to an actually international organization of workers. Some of the excitement that I found in reading Harris's correspondence with Du Bois comes from seeing the senior intellectual sounding out his younger comrade. After an 18-month silence, due apparently to the death of Harris's father, Du Bois wrote, quote, I have been rereading Marx recently, as everyone else has these days. I have the 3 volumes of Capital and the small Vanguard book by Max Eastman, but I write to ask you if you will send me a list of the 4 or 5 best books which the perfect Marxian must know. Marxian. This is like a thing Adam remembers from that summer, where I was very invested in where and how thinkers were using the term Marxian, or I was wondering if it should be pronounced Martian rather than Marxist, which we can talk a little bit more about in a second. Please rush these. Let's see at the bottom of the second paragraph. William Sandy Darity, a Duke-based political scientist who has recently spent nearly 40 years encouraging deeper attention to Harris's life and writing, records the great irony of Harris's legacy. Quote, economists who still fantasize about the rise of a Black financial empire in the United States often refer to Harris's book, The Negro as Capitalist from 1936, as the reference book. But ironically, they rarely make note of the central message of Harris's work, that prospects for successful Black capitalism in the United States were then non-existent. And I should say sort of explicitly that it is a book that seeks to study attempts to form self-consciously black banking systems. The theory being that this was sort of the creation of white-collar financial work was integral to the instantiation of the black middle class that found not just limited success, but active hostility from sort of extant financial instruments. And this, part of the reason for the mistake in the sort of reputation and the argument of Harris's work is that he would eventually become the first black member of the University of Chicago's political science department and would flirt with some of the, say, social Darwinism that came to be associated with the University of Chicago during the 1950s. That said, his account of teaching at the University of Chicago is sort of strange, and apparently, despite his really remarkable early academic career, he was barred from graduate teaching throughout his duration at the University of Chicago and often wrote that he wished that he hadn't made the move. In Harris, it seemed I had found the precise kind of young black intellectual who might be interested in the quantitative representation as well as the lived felt experience of the problem that I was pursuing. So in July 2022, I wanted to get a sense of Du Bois and Harris's correspondence, to see if and how they registered the Depression's sweeping black dispossession over weeks and months rather than census years, and to see if and how their concerns about black labor organizing and exploitation took on a transnational cast, and whether either had indicated that they were in touch with anyone who might provide an indication of conditions on the ground in other parts of the diaspora. I called the H correspondence box for the relevant years. Literary scholars, at least, tend to develop research programs via significant individuals and concepts, but the capriciousness of alphabetization yields unpredictable alignments. I often think, when opening a fresh archival box, of the ancient Greek astronomical concept, syzygy, S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y. Meaning literally yoked together, it refers to an illusion of celestial coordination produced by our situated perspective, rather than an equal participation in a singular moving design. Polaris is over 300 light years beyond Kochab, and it is only because we're here on this planet at this moment in universal history that they together become the stars of the tale of Ursa Minor. French surrealist Alfred Jarry's fascination with this concept, syzygy, had more to do with newspapers and the kind of ideological conjunctions produced by the need to accommodate certain amounts of column space. And in box 54 of the Du Bois correspondence, treating the letter H in the year 1930, I got an unexpected confirmation of my suspicion. Harris's letters to Du Bois and Du Bois's carbons are held in folder 5. Folder 6 holds his correspondence with novelist, poet, and former Crisis literary editor Jessie Fawcett, who had married Herbert Harris the previous year. Du Bois was writing to her to translate an essay of his into French, and she would not reply. But in folder 4, I found that about 6 weeks before Du Bois would provide Harris with a response to his forthcoming study of black labor organizing successes and failures, entitled The Black Worker, which would come out in 1931, Du Bois had sent an inquiry to the editor of Harper's magazine. Quote, "Sir, I'm writing to ask if you might be interested in an article on Abyssinia. The coronation of the new emperor in November emphasizes the way in which Abyssinia is connected with modern political and economic life. May I indicate the chief points?" Having pitched my share of magazine articles, and now having seen enough of Du Bois's other inquiries, I can pretty confidently say that what Du Bois indicates is not a summary, but a fully structured article in condensed form, complete with an engaging lead about an American engineering firm that was then negotiating a contract to dam the headwaters of the Nile. This project, Du Bois explains, touches English and Egyptian politics, and the English are charging slave labor. Over 8 numbered paragraphs, Du Bois offers a consideration of a counterintuitive vulnerability of the young republic. Not having borrowed any substantial sums from any European powers, there was then no globe-spanning military presence with a vested interest in Abyssinia's continued economic independence, as well as anxiety about what its independence might mean for the vast majority of the people of the continent who were living in active extractive colonies. Du Bois also provides an overview of some frustrated but ongoing efforts at connection between the Abyssinian state and Black American communities, including the recent appointment of Dr. Malaku Bayan, who by then had taken a second degree at Howard during Abram Harris's 3rd year on faculty and Sterling Brown's second, to take charge of Abyssinian health and sanitation. To me now, this document provides a fascinating detail of Du Bois's early Depression interest in a specific global Black struggle, and in African colonialism not just as an ongoing system of dispossessing Black people, but as a site of looming intensification amidst the Depression. His writing also sheds significant light on some challenging Black writing from the later Depression in a manner I'll describe at the end. But Du Bois's specific focus on Abyssinia precedes Haile Selassie's coronation and has its origins in dark water, and before that in religious verse. In his reading of Psalm 68, from which Du Bois took the title of his essay about the First World War's origins in European colonialism in Africa at the hands of Ethiopia. And in John Milton's Il Penseroso, a 17th century paean to a brooding, productive melancholia, which Du Bois quotes in his celebration of Black femininity and maternity, the damnation of women. I have the Penseroso here, and the underlined and italicized bits are what Du Bois sort of quotes out, but I want to show you them sort of in full context. Black, but such as in esteem Prince Memnon's sister might beseem, or that starred Ethiop queen that strove to set her beauty's praise above the sea nymphs and their powers offended. In the poem here, Milton is playing the Greek myth of Cassiopeia, whose heretical claim of superior beauty pushed Poseidon to flood Ethiopia. Du Bois's selected quotation eliminates the punishment for apparently heretical self-love, while also burying what Toni Morrison might have noticed was a self-conscious Africanist presence in Milton's mythopoetic psychology, with an idiosyncratic early Protestant turning the polysemy between chromatic, nocturnal, and racial significations of Black into a site of potent syzygy. Fitting for a goddess who had become a constellation, and yet the inclusion of conflict presumably ran counter to honoring Black beauty. Still, Du Bois, in the essay The Damnation of Women, follows these lines with a litany of radical insurgent Black heroines throughout ancient and modern history. Du Bois's own poetry is less obviously connected, but will lead us beyond accumulating references, as we might accumulate information about global Black life, towards Du Bois's deeper questions about how a world-spanning nation might conceive of living together and being adequate to each other. Between the second and third essays in Dark Water, The Souls of White Folk in the Hands of Ethiopia, Du Bois includes a poem of his own that initially appeared in the Crisis as The Burden of Black Women, but came to be titled The Riddle of the Sphinx. This is an idea, and the idea of the Riddle of the Sphinx is like Du Bois's term for this question of inadequate humanity is something that kind of stretches throughout his career. As far as I can tell, he first uses it as the title of the penultimate chapter in John Brown, where he positions the challenge to live up to John Brown's example as the riddle of the Sphinx for those who remained. This poem is a stark departure from the Victorian metrical verse juxtaposed above the essays of the Souls of Black Folk, here deploying accentual anaphora to implicate diasporic resentment and international jealousy in the persistence of exploitation. Unthankful we wince in the east, unthankful we wail from the westward, unthankfully thankful we curse in the unworn wastes of the wild. I hate them, oh I hate them well, who raise the fools in their glory, the Black men of Egypt and Ind, Ethiopia's sons in the evening, Indians and yellow Chinese, Arabian children of morning, and mongrels of Rome and Greece. Ah well, and they that raise the boasters shall drag them down again, till some dim, darker David a-hoeing his corn, and married maiden, mother of God, bid the Black Christ be born. You can see, so I've given you on the left-hand side the sort of first presentation in the Crisis. On the right-hand side, a really sort of remarkable document from Credo, where you can see Du Bois continuing to edit his own publication even after Dark Water. His relationship to his own poetry was clearly kind of living, and he was interested in these documents not as sort of fixed in print, but as alive and open to revision. What I take from these lines is that we are all everywhere cursed by some history, and thus all together waiting for the next new epoch. Where Milton had recuperated his emotional lethargy as the path to isolated genius, Du Bois strikes his own mythopoetic key, animated, polemical, and universally self-critical. Such is his listing logic that we, reader, no matter who or where we are, will eventually be implicated in these first-person plurals, and then again in his first-person singulars. The Riddle of the Sphinx lets us know that Du Bois's interest in Abyssinia had to do with making myth manifest by connecting the modern to the ancient, but also with alerting his readers to the challenging possibility that these times too might be mythic, that the posture of universal belonging denoted by cosmopolitan has less to do with being suave or refined or polylingual, and everything to do with aspiring to meet people where they are rather than collecting places. This is, I think, part of what he means in the essay The Souls of White Folk, when he implicates that moment from Psalm 68 in his description of the colonies as appearing worldwide, quote, but they cluster in the tropics with its darkened people, in Hong Kong and Annam, in Borneo and Rhodesia, in Sierra Leone and Nigeria, in Panama and Havana. These are the El Dorados to which the world powers stretch their itching palms. Via Dark Water, We can also understand why Du Bois thought that a wide, intelligent, affluent, predominantly white audience would need to know about Abyssinia's fragile independence. We can understand why he would have thought that a magazine would be interested in an article about it too. The essay, The Hands of Ethiopia, first appeared in the Atlantic Monthly in 1915 as an article entitled The African Roots of War, while The Souls of White Folk contains part of an article that had appeared in The Independent. Why he sought to place this work in Harper specifically is another question. Du Bois, did I go too far? Yeah. Du Bois had previously expressed skepticism about finding a home in Harper's. Oh wait, before I move forward, I just want to point out, so this is the issue of Harper's that was on the newsstand the month that Du Bois sent out his inquiry. And the image on the left is a little difficult to see, so I've blown up the table of contents on the front page. And you can see my favorite of the articles is history a fraud? Du Bois had previously expressed skepticism about finding a home at Harper's. Historically, Harper's had carved out a kind of conciliatory position prior to the Civil War, leading some sort of more explicitly abolitionist thinkers to refer to it as Harper's Weekly, W-E-A-K-L-Y. And pitching a travel diary for an upcoming trip to Germany and the Soviet Union, Du Bois had written in July of 1925, quote, "Over 20 years ago, when I began to write, the editor of Harper's commended my writing, but urged me not to write about Negroes. I took the liberty of disregarding his advice. Although your magazine keeps to its tradition of saying as little as possible about Negroes, now and then dark folks do get into your pages." One of my favorite details of this letter as well is that instead of sending along like his clips or like anything that might kind of introduce him as a writer, he also refers the editor to the entry about him in Who's Who in America, a kind of annual guidebook of who was intellectually significant, which I think is like, pretty punk rock. I think he must have been attracted by Harper's 1920s rebrand as a philosophically serious and outward-facing American magazine, promoting academics turned public intellectuals like Bertrand Russell and Charles A. Beard. This rebrand had been quite successful, too. At the end of 1929, the circulation of Harper's had reached 132,000 copies, about even with The Atlantic, whose numbers were on the decline, and significantly above Scribner's and other similar publications. The Crisis, meanwhile, had gone from a circulation of about 65,000 in 1920 to under 30,000 in 1930. We might infer that Harper's did not just represent a wide, white intellectual audience, but also a kind of cultural recognition that the Du Bois of 1930 was seeking for this particular issue. But in 1930, the article about Abyssinia never appeared. A rejection note from Harper's editor, Thomas B. Wells, followed a week later. Nothing would give me greater pleasure than to publish something by you in Harper's Magazine. Yet I'm sorry that I cannot feel the subject you outline is one that is likely to appeal to any considerable group of our readers. Disappointing. This note and its indication of minimal audience interest must have been annoying too, although I'm not terribly invested in revenging this slight, so much as thinking about what this episode means here and today. And as the image on the right-hand side lets you know, shortly after Du Bois got this rejection, he then queried H.L. Mencken at the American Mercury to see if they might take the article, which they also declined, although in decidedly more coherent terms, and then Du Bois more or less dropped the issue. But here and today, I'm following Haitian anthropologist Michel-Rolph Trouillot, whose Silencing the Past of 1995 theorized the politics of representation that shape monuments and sites and works of historical commemoration. Quote, "To say what is known must include the present will seem self-evident, but it may be less obvious that historical authenticity resides not in fidelity to an alleged past, but in an honesty vis-a-vis the present as it represents that past. Over the past 2 years, I have been thinking about why this is history that I want to uncover, and why Du Bois's notes seem so significant to it. Partly, I am drawn to the transnational experimental impulses of the Great Depression through an accident of Generation Place. Graduating college shortly after 2008, I became aware of and then interested in how the uneven experience of economic downturn can be, and how that unevenness can create unpredictable connections across space and lived experience. Cheap pleasures are easy pleasures, and telling somebody about something that they can get for free feels an awful lot like exchanging a gift. Finding people creating consequential art and thought in such close proximity to their having a good time, and finding that they did so without losing sight of the necessary possibility of a better future feels important and real. Still, following Simon Kikandi, who warns us that, quote, the global nature of modernism is easy to confuse for universalism, I wade into this work aware of and worried about how often Africa and Africanness are deployed in the service of claims for modernism's porousness and breadth. Too often, the logic of difference is used to shore up claims about cosmopolitanism, as if influence and interest always come from a place of comprehensive appreciation. Du Bois's article might have found a home if Harper's readers had been at risk of taking a trip to Mount Toto, which might in turn have changed what drew my eye as I opened box 54. But I've also been thinking about Du Bois's refused article through the rise of the Public Humanities, a recent coinage that seems to refer to academics writing for venues that are not scholarly peer-reviewed journals, and to their speaking about their work in contexts other than in classrooms and at conferences. The fact that the term imagines these behaviors to be recent, strange, and beyond the scholar's typical ken speaks to a problem. To pick one recent advocate, Yale's Jonathan Kramnick concludes his recent survey of the state of literary study, criticism, and truth with a qualified injunction to perform, seeing in the magazines and websites the Los Angeles Review of Books, N+1, Public Books, LitHub, and others, quote, a vitality of public-facing criticism that has a clear relation to the present crisis in higher education. It means to develop an audience and support for the humanities at a time when majors are dropping and humanistic writing is ignored or misunderstood. It means to find work and an audience for scholars marooned by the present employment catastrophe. But one challenge of public-facing writing is that it has yet no clear feedback in the more traditional academic practice. I have a lot of problems with this. Having written for a few of the listed publications, I can tell you that claims about support and finding work cannot possibly be meant in terms of remuneration. These places often do not pay, or pay well below the cost of a babysitter for a single evening, while commissioning work that requires weeks of research. I'm also skeptical that an audience is developing rather than coalescing. Very few of my friends who do not work for universities read these websites, no matter how voracious or culturally engaged. While I'm also not sure that traditional academic practice's peer reviewing is so rigorous or distinct. But more than any of these individual points, Kramnick positions these recent venues as somehow distinct from the legacy publications of criticism like Harper's, while also failing to acknowledge that the whims and trends and prejudices that shape popular editing seem more dangerous than the absence of an approving paragraph from a PhD. Freelancers here know fairly often that the fact that a serious philosophical magazine offering worldly engagement might preemptorily have turned down a renowned intellectual seems illustrative. And it strikes me as significant that the rise of Harper's that Du Bois sought to join, and he would continue to pitch the magazine throughout the 1930s with that success, occurred amidst a previous employment catastrophe. Du Bois wouldn't have used the term public humanities. Its distinctiveness signals a sluggish recovery from contented obscurity, whereas his career is marked by the belief that challenging an audience will help to grow that audience, to grow in size and in intelligence, but also in empathy. But Du Bois should be considered a paradigmatic example of the practice, and the fact that he is not puzzles me. About 2 weeks later, I had the chance to read Harris's correspondence with Sterling Brown, which had been housed at Howard University for many years, but was sold to Williams College during the early days of the pandemic. While I had thought that it was exciting and understandable that Harris's correspondence with Du Bois had resumed with a note in which Harris asked where he might find a copy of Du Bois's doctoral thesis, as Harris was then finishing his own dissertation, I do not yet realize the difficult situation barely concealed by the second part of that note. Would you also forward me the article I submitted about a year ago? Harris asked. I referred to the Black communists in Dixie. I don't think it's worth publishing. In fact, I feel you are of the same opinion in as much as you have kept it a year without publishing it. Harris must have breathed quite a sigh of relief when Du Bois replied 3 days later, quote, I still would like to keep and eventually use your Black communists in Dixie, but I have kept it longer than I have any right to ask, and therefore at your request, I am returning it. This was lucky, because Charles S. Johnson had already accepted Black communists in Dixie for the July issue of Opportunity, where it ran with a headnote explaining that it was a thinly fictionalized account of Harris's own efforts to form a Black socialist branch in Richmond, Virginia in the years following the First World War. The lively and sarcastic piece ends with a apparent transcription of a letter credited to Workers' Party Secretary named Reginfort Badgley that dissolves the black branch and charges them with having betrayed, quote, petty bourgeois tendencies by continuing to stress the race question. Harris heightens the irony in Badgley's postscript. "O hail the communists, on with the social revolution, the black lamb and the white lion shall lie down together." Here we can see a kind of parodic insistence on a message of interracial comradeship cast in freighted biblical terms. Freelancer's heresy avoided. Harris became a vital advocate for Du Bois's campaign against Fisk's increasingly socially conservative white president, and then became active in the NAACP shortly thereafter. By 1931, Harris had published his first book, co-written with Sterling D. Spiro, The Black Worker, the Negro, and the Labor Movement, and was publishing extensively in The Crisis, The Nation, and elsewhere. But he was frustrated, as this note to Sterling Brown attests. "My dear Sterling, I had better hurry and reply to your letter, or you will be saying all the nasty things about me that I have said about your failure to write to me. Although I am quite busy trying to get out a few things for publication, I can't use this as an excuse should I delay writing. You'd no doubt come back with the rejoinder that I am my own boss and can delay my work when I like, whereas you have at least two taskmasters, Old Man French and Old Man English, who will not permit a cessation of work no matter how important the reason for stopping may be. You will want to know what became of that article on class struggle. Well, Harper's was on the verge of accepting it, but the associate editor reminded Hartman, the editor-in-chief, that the former editor had encouraged Walter White to do an article on the communists of Scottsboro. In Hartman's absence, it was returned to me with a flattering note. Then I sent it to Daschle of Scribner's, who returned it with a comment that it was a skillfully wrought piece of work that could not be accepted because Harper's was about to run a piece by Walter. Daschle asked for something I can't do right away, and at present the article, and I think here he's actually spelt it article, A-R-T-I-K-I-L-L, is with the Virginia Quarterly Review. I don't know how good they are, but I think you suggested them to me. Another work of radical black thought, another attempt at Harper's, and another refusal, affirming my interest in the Du Bois Abyssinia article draft. But this time, Harris had received a substantive explanation, one that involved excluding the young Marxist scholar for the work of an established journalist and recent head of the NAACP, Walter White, who was then and would remain staunchly opposed to any sweeping socialist agenda, and who would become a significant factor in Du Bois's resignation from the Crisis and the association that he had helped to found. In the fall before he did so, Du Bois would ease back into teaching at Atlanta University by offering a seminar on Karl Marx and the Negro. Surely class struggle would be part of this program. This seemed like a significant sudden development in Harris's thinking. When the black worker is interested in class struggle, it is interested in it as a shibboleth for a failure of international communist organizations that had adopted a policy of, quote, boring from within. Now I think we would generally call this practice assaulting. But the practice involves joining various black radical organizations like the Universal Negro Improvement Association, headed by Marcus Garvey, and seeking to, quote, guide the Garvey movement away from the shoals of utopianism and towards anti-imperialism in the labor movement. Concluding their analysis of these efforts, Harris and Spiro deploy familiar sarcasm. Quote, if apathy to the class struggle denotes a bourgeois psychology, the Porters are as middle class in their economic orientation as the Association for the Advancement of Colored People in its bias toward political rights and civil liberties. Anyone but doctrinaire and optimistic apostles of proletarian revolution would soon tire of sowing the seeds of revolution on such stony ground. One can understand why Du Bois replied to a draft of this work in progress by saying, quote, I am very much pleased with the book. I think it is the best and only thing which we will have on the subject. Two things will kill it, of course, for wider circulation. That is, its price and its sincerity. I needed only to find the article that Harris was circulating to see how his bitter sincerity had approached the subject that he was so often critical of others for avoiding. And I was excited by the idea that the poet Sterling Brown was sufficiently interested to be kept apprised of its movements through press. Perhaps Old Man French and Old Man English, euphemisms I take it for poetic composition, were sufficiently invested as well. In Brent Hayes Edwards' The Taste of the Archive, he draws on his own experience in colonial archives in France to push back on the idea of the archive as a space of accessible and constant revelation. Quote, as anyone who has spent any time in an archive knows, the vast majority of what finds there is mundane and monotonous, the record of inexorable production of the ordinary. Even when one happens across something unusual, it is most often recalcitrant, even nomic, a lump that cannot be placed into anything approaching historical intelligibility. In Harris's letter to Brown, I found my lump. For copyright reasons, magazines tend to keep extensive holdings of correspondence with freelancers, and I'm fortunate to have a friend at Harper's who could access their private corporate phone. But he was not able to find any evidence of this article by Harris, nor any correspondence with Lee F. Hartman, who had edited Harper's from 1931 until his sudden death in 1941, and who does, in fact, seem to have been more invested in articles about Black life than his predecessors. I had no luck at Scriveners or the VQR either. And when I wrote to Sandy Darity at Duke in November of 2022, he was skeptical that the article ever appeared or that a draft was retained. Nothing like it was held in the archival collection from Harris's Howard years, and quote, I have doubts that Harris's paper ever was published, in large measure because post-1936, he simply stopped writing about race. In the years immediately following this correspondence with Sterling Brown, Harris's writing splits according to audience. His magazine writing would sustain through the 1930s, but would increasingly focus on the economic specificities of the Soviet Union. Although he would eventually publish in Harper's, his Economics of the Founding Fathers enters into a familiar debate about the differing political ideologies of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, with Harris suggesting that it was not actually about agrarian or commercial financial orientations, so much as a question about whether one took inspiration from, quote, the petty bourgeois radicalism of the leaders of the French Revolution in Jefferson, or were more inspired by the, quote, middle-class liberalism of England in the figure of Hamilton. However persuasive the article ends up being, there is something willfully perverse about this argument, denying both American leaders any semblance of originality or independence in their thinking, and sorting them into pre-existing middle-class European ideals. But the question of slavery and its place in the founding and framing of the American Republic receives little mention. In Harris's subsequent scholarly publishing, however, something of the flame remains. He introduces that much misunderstood study, the Negro as capitalist, by regretting that time and expense prevented him from the tripartite structure of his initial plan, which had been to begin by covering Africa and the rise of capitalism. But he does begin the study by pointing out the horrible fact that much of the physical gold used to buy and sell enslaved people and their labor came itself from African mines. Still more affecting is the long detour into the life of Paul Cuff, a Black man born free in Dartmouth, Massachusetts in 1759, who became a successful merchant sailor, who encountered the free Black community in Sierra Leone in 1811 and tried to encourage trade between Sierra Leone and the young United States. Quote, that Cuff's trips to Africa were financial failures can be attributed to his zeal for racial improvement, which outweighed his original business prudence. In this respect, he was the forerunner of a large number of Negroes who have attempted to mix business and racial uplift. This is a very different kind of class struggle, where and how the affluent but marginalized encounter their inability to make substantial lasting improvements in the lives of their under-resourced communities, as well as where and how those without enough for themselves are moved to give what they cannot live without. This is the kind of class struggle that saturates the writing of the later 1930s by many of the writers who have been part of the New Negro movement, much of which would also go unpublished or fall out of print fairly quickly, which has lately come into view. George Schuyler had feuded with Du Bois over his depiction of Liberian forced labor practices in his novel Slaves Today from 1931, and would follow it with a series of more audacious, pulpy depictions of Black American optimism and entanglement in the Horn of Africa. Claude McKay's novel Amiable with Big Teeth, written in 1941 with the distinction of being McKay's only novel written on American soil, fictionalizes Abyssinian fundraising efforts in Harlem amidst the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and shows that the local self-taught Dr. Kwasi is a better fundraiser, because more vivid and a better research speaker, than the Abyssinian government themselves. The sympathy of Harlemites is exploited, but only because it has its basis in their commendable hopes for knowledge and international community. And Sterling Brown's second poetry collection, No Hiding Place, the controversial content of which would cause it to miss its scheduled 1937 publication date, is riven with moments of cruel optimism and limits found. But one of my favorites is this strange lyric, Negro Improvement League, a poem that explicitly plays on Gwendolyn Bennett's To a Dark Girl, which was one of the breakout inclusions in James Weldon Johnson's 1922 anthology, The Book of American Negro Poetry. The sort of historical coordinate with McKay's Harlem Shadows, where Bennett had celebrated the sorrowful beauty of her addressee and had implored her to laugh at the forces of fate that would have had her still enslaved. Sterling Brown's work is jaunty, bawdy, bewildered, and sarcastic. The speaker tumbles out onto a busy Manhattan street to find a ridiculous parade, the cause of which is not a visiting dignitary or a victory abroad, but the presence of a stunning girl named Gwendolyn with her impudent brown face. But at the end, the poem pulls back. The final stanza reads, "Progressive Ethiopians, societies for race advance, should go down on their knees and thank her mother and her dad." This is a complicated gesture, one at once satirical and elevating. Contra Bennett, Brown's Gwendolyn is merely hot. She's really quite too bad, without her beauty becoming a path to melancholia and the tectonics of fate. But then, I think we need to take that reference in the final stanza seriously. The idea here that Black beauty is itself a potent argument for racial uplift. Whatever my frustrations with arguments like Jonathan Kramnick's, the fact remains that there are increasingly public humanists. There are scholars and theorists who are seeking and finding audiences beyond classrooms and conferences, and there are significantly more of them now than there were at the end of the previous century. A great many are leading conversations about race, history, and the necessary work of accounting for oneself within them. One such thinker is Christina Sharp, whose In the Wake fundamentally changed the way that we see and say the words wake, ship, hold, and weather. Sharp's most recent book, Ordinary Notes, takes the success and influence of her previous work of theoretically and historiographically rich interpretations as an occasion for thinking about her place in academic literary study and about the hostility that she encountered during her training and early career. Written in stanzas, Sharp shifts from recent encounters with newly built or renovated museums dedicated to the legacy of enslavement, with considerations of the emotional and experiential boundaries that traditional academic practice seems to require, and how her refusal of those boundaries became integral to her unexpected emergence as a significant public intellectual. Note 73 reads in full, quote, "Following the publication of In the Wake, many people asked me about the process of writing an academic book that speaks to and beyond the academy. More specifically, people wanted to know about the form and also about the first chapter, The Wake, which begins in the register of the autobiographical, of my recounting the deaths in close succession of 3 members of my immediate family between May 2013 and February 2014. It was an ethical decision to include them, because while I was reading and writing and thinking about Black people being murdered, and about what we make in the face of all that structural violence, I was in the midst of so much personal loss. I thought that this loss also needed to be on the page explicitly, not just implicitly in the ways that, whether one admits it or not, one is oriented to one's work from the location of the body and all that that may mean. It is the note that begins the book." Many academics will refer to their previous work, but the full impact of that offset last line requires a bit of close reading. Sharp moves from the from the past tense of the moment of writing that defines a substantial paragraph into the present continuous tense that is the convention of academic literary study. With it, the previous book rejoins us in the present, and the need that it answered is not momentarily but enduringly acknowledged. These notes are essays in the sense of trying and testing, but also in the exploratory sense of searching, mapping without fixing or freezing. This is fitting. Sharp's attention to where and how the deceptively simple, polysemic vocabulary of the practice of transatlantic slavery roves beyond its initial discursive locations is a durable and potent part of her method. But this tense play seems more like a subtle way of incorporating the process of thinking into writing, of thoughts unfinished even from previous work, as well as theories raised and considered before committed to truth or discarded. It is hard to imagine this occurring within the voice and written conventions of traditional academic practice, but it seems much more significant than writing for a website. Sharp helps us to see that Du Bois does something similar when, in Dusk of Dawn, he arrives at a moment of crisis in his genealogical self-study as it becomes a historical review of his own thinking. This book is distinctive because, unlike The Souls of Black Folk and unlike Dark Water, its essays did not have their origins in magazines. They were written for the book in concept. Rather than propose a comprehensive new theory, he admits that, quote, "The concept of race has changed and so presented so much of a contradiction that as I face Africa myself, I ask myself, what is it between us that constitutes a tie which I can feel better than I can explain?" It is one thing to fail to find the words in daily life, but quite another to find that Du Bois's words have fled. But it can only be what it is, a feeling, something that exists before language and before theory. Du Bois would never write for Harper's, but he would not stop writing about Africa either. Lately, I have been reading Dusk of Dawn through the refused article, not simply in terms of subject matter, but rhetorically, tactically. Seeing in the collection from the Depression's rocky end, not just ideas developed with more patience than an article allows, but also moments of exposure, when he too is, like Sharp, oriented to one's work from the location of the body and all that that may mean. That genealogical self-study becomes a historical review breaks abruptly into a recollection of his own first trip to Africa. It happens with the opposite of patience, but abruptness too is a vital tempo, and one that popular venues won't necessarily allow. Quote, "But one thing is sure, and that is the fact that since the 15th century, these ancestors of mine and their other descendants have had a common history, have suffered a common disaster, and have one long memory. It is this unity that draws me to Africa. When shall I forget the night that I first set foot on African soil? I am the 6th generation in descent from forefathers who left this land. The moon was at the full, and the waters of the Atlantic lay like a lake. All the long, slow afternoon, as the sun robed herself in her western scarlet, with veils of misty cloud, I had seen Africa afar. Cape Mount, that mighty headland with its twin curves, northern sentinel of the realm of Liberia, gathered itself out of the cloud at 3:30 and then darkened and grew clear. The stars stood forth curiously twisted. Orion in the zenith, the Little Bear asleep, and the Southern Cross rising behind the horizon. Then afar, ahead, a lone light shone straight at the ship's fore. Twinkling lights appeared below, around, and rising shadows. Monrovia, said the captain. They've arrived on Christmas, and after Christmas dinner, they step outside to take a better look at that up-twisted sky and find that Cassiopeia has joined Orion at zenith, the Little Bear beneath the horizon, and now unfamiliar sights in the Milky Way, all awry, a living, sun for snow at Christmas, and happiness and cheer. This is a place where the North Star's work is over and it is allowed to slumber, and the Ethiopian goddess who became a constellation, who came to Du Bois through Milton, is at her zenith. This is what Du Bois means in that collection's opening, when he reflects on the overemphasis of material advancement. Quote, "It would not do to concenter all effort on economic well-being and forget freedom and manhood and equality. Rather, we must live and eat and strive and still hold unfaltering commerce with the stars. To look above, to aspire, and to think about the community of others through the specificity of emplacement." Syzygy. Thanks.
Thank you. We've got time for questions, so I've got it.
What's the next step?
The next step is that the research isn't done. I think in some respects, this is a kind of meta-turn, right? It is an interest in the conditions that prevented the dissemination of the information that I was interested in, but it also speaks to this sort of uncomfortable kind of frictive presence. I think where it's headed in the book project is it's helping me to think about what are the potential transnational stakes of Sterling Brown's poetry, which, while pretty emphatically American, is really interested in kind of tours around the Black Belt and thinking about where and how, in a moment of downturn and dispossession, those more sort of regional community formation processes should be understood not simply in terms of a kind of regional chauvinism, but actually as preparations for the conditions of global solidarity. So that's kind of where it's headed. And I think, there's something a little, again, perverse about that, because Brown is so, so sort of emphatically regionally focused. But I'm really trying to think about where and how, I guess, that like universalizing impulse can be allayed by thinking specifically about communities in contact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So do you have more research that you're planning to do in the archives here or digitally? At this point?
At this point, yeah. Well, this is also like one of the reasons that Du Bois is so much fun to think with is that he's like never actually really done anything. He's so interested in returning to problems that he's sort of previously considered, and I think as his career progresses, in particular in Dusk of Dawn, is really, really generous about where he sees limits in his thinking in the past. One of my favorite kind of poetic tics in the chapter of Dusk of Dawn where he talks about his own education is that he frames sort of constantly, he'll get to a kind of summative moment, whether he's graduating college or his doctorate or whatever, and explain what he worked on and what he learned, and then say, but on the other hand, here's everything that I didn't learn at that point. And so I guess right now the challenge for the book is to write it, but I also need to stop finding other poets that I want to write about. Is part of the problem.
Or maybe you'll find out how those other poets have some resonance from the Du Bois.
Oh, I'm always finding that. That's really annoying. Yeah, it was really...
You escape Du Bois,
never. Although his reading Milton specifically was really exciting to me. I mean, the poem Il Penseroso is like, it's part of the kind of dyad that Milton writes. The other poem is called L'Allegro, and it's usually understood to be kind of Milton's advocacy for melancholia as like the ideal artistic disposition. And so the other poem is like beautiful in a kind of conventional sense, but exists mainly as a kind of straw man poem to like hold up Il Penseroso, which means kind of literally the thinker. And so seeing Du Bois kind of finding not just himself or not just a kind of resonance, but also a kind of potted sort of mythopoetic racial history in there was like really exciting for me and really sort of fun to see. That too is slightly different than the poetic taste that I typically associate with him. I think of him as like really, really enthralled with like 1840s, 1850s kind of like people like Browning or Tennyson. And so going back to Milton was sort of unexpected and very fun. Does that actually sound accurate to you?
I mean, this is not my problems. So I hesitate to defend it. Yes, I mean, I think we run into, with Du Bois, that double, he has so many identities, but he exists. And in that sort of romantic heart of his imagination, there is always a very sort of 19th century sensibility with whether it's regarded to music, with Wagner and Beethoven and so on, or which sort of led him to sort of reject jazz. Or whether it's in terms of reading Walter Scott or whoever it is, that I think that he's steeped in a certain, certain things that captured his imagination as a young man. What I think you see in his writing, and obviously in his correspondence and in his enjoyment and patronage of other poets and other cultural contributors, is this like great appetite that you described, and that's almost kind of like falling over himself to sort of get hold of it. And I mean, this leads to my question, if I may, which is, process oriented, something which is, about you go into the archives, which are predominantly correspondence. Most of what we have in the Du Bois papers by a huge ratio, something like 90% is letters, or things sent back and forth, receipts of it, article received, await response. That is the bulk of the boxes, and that I feel like, as I was listening to this, I'm thinking about Du Bois in the 1930s, going back to Atlanta, going back also to long form publishing, and in the longest form that he ever did was Black Reconstruction, and seeking Marxist, Martian perspectives, but also thinking about this idea of public humanities, public history in the case of he writes a letter around this time in the late 30s where he says, I've got this amazing book, this really important book, and he says, but of course it won't sell well, which echoes with some of what he's saying in Say from Paris. So the sense of we're doing really important stuff, no one's going to read it. And the American Historical Review never publishes a review of until 2020 or whatever they finally got around to it. But basically what I'm sort of groping towards here is how a question of you as a researcher and as someone who has this interesting and giftful sort of interdisciplinarity, how we make use of such a daunting mountain of information that is presented in the form of the correspondence that we have. How do you find those trails, and how do you follow them, and then how can you lay the breadcrumbs behind you for others?
Thanks. One thing that I would like this. I spent 45 minutes talking about an accident that happened with one box once. So I suppose, sitting with it, this is such an annoying answer, but like methodologically, like patience is so important. The ability to be receptive to conjunction seems to require time that is not, that can be hard to find, that the Du Bois Center actually provides, where you're able to not just sort of dip in and out because you're working on one project and you need to sort of substantiate it, but to have the time and the space to play, to open the, this is like, the material is digitized, which is great if you need to call a scan of something that you already know is there, but it's not very helpful for locating material that you don't already know about, right? Or that you don't know is going to be important based on sort of searchable keywords. And so this is where that accident of constellation does still need to happen in the physical archive, from my perspective. And then at that point, it's like, how much of yourself do you give to it, I think is the question. And you will find, I think, that it makes claims on you as much as you make claims on it, right? This is, I think, as hopefully the talk sort of made clear, I don't know that the Du Bois article draft would have mattered to me quite as much if I hadn't shortly thereafter seen this sort of Harris thing. And this is, I didn't have space for it in the talk, but like, this is also like a moment of sort of intensive sort of coordination between the two of them. I'm glad you brought up Black Reconstruction, not just because it's also sort of importantly poetically sort of curated in the sort of chapter terminuses, but Harris kind of cut his throat in a review of Black Reconstruction, and then a couple of years later would review a kind of roundup of leftist intellectuals who had taken on Black Reconstruction as a provocation and sort of extended its message, pretty vociferously arguing against them as well. So Harris, Black Reconstruction actually becomes, I think, pretty central to the falling out between Du Bois and Harris. And, interesting. In a way that like the Harris of 1931 is sort of hard to anticipate. There's also, and this is to the point about sort of correspondence, you're also only able to work with the conversation between people who are in the same place. And so like the Harris-Brown correspondence that I have entirely takes place during Harris's sort of fellowship terms where he goes back to Columbia, and so he's sending letters to his friend in DC. But like, if you're in the same place, you can kind of just like go and talk. And there's a letter that like, there's a letter from Harris to Du Bois that suggests a moment that I would love to know more about that doesn't appear to be recorded anywhere, which is an invitation in 1931 from Harris to Du Bois to hang out with this Young Turks group. And he has a line in the letter where he says something like, social conduct can be so difficult and there are so many rules. I make this request to you directly. Here's who will be there. There will be no women. There will be cigarettes and alcohol. And it seems clear that Du Bois had a night with these guys. and I want to know what happened there. I'm also, concerned about why the fact that there would be no women needed to be indicated.
That's dropped out of me too. Maybe we should do the same.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a great place to end it. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. This is a terrific example of the kind of scholarship that is, I think, not just in the Du Boisian tradition, but the kind that we hope to support here. Because, as you said, it's based in being given the time to play in the archive.
Yeah.
So I think what you've just done is just demonstrate, hopefully, the sort of the ways in which this fellowship, which I mean, as well as also a true fellowship in the sense that it is a shared study and shared research opportunity can produce wonderful results. So that's blowing the centre's trumpet a little bit, but also it really is a fantastic and exciting.
But even like from an archival arrangement perspective, if someone had decided to organize that correspondence purely based on proper names rather than by years in proper names, I wouldn't defend this either, right? If Du Bois's papers had been organized the way that the Beinecke organizes them, all the Harris stuff would be in one box, and I would never seen anything else. So it is actually, again, like, it's an accident of the archive, but it's an accident of a very specific kind of organization, and I would love to more with that. Cool. Well, thanks.
So much to find out, so little time. Thanks again.
Truly.